Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today I am going to compare the basic techniques of Asayama Ichiden-ryū Kenjutsu with Italian longsword, more in the specific Fiore delivery longsword. So the basics I am talking about are the Koteuchi 22 Kaijo, which are 22 ways of hitting the wrist of the opponent, and are showcased in the video you're watching right now, which I'll link in the description. Very good, so this first action is represented in the Fiore system by what Fiore calls crossing at the tip of the sword, incrociare in punta di spada, which basically is a condition that you may reach in a variety of ways, and from that condition you can either thrust straight at the opponent or rotate your sword and cut on the other side of the weapon of the opponent, which is precisely what Seki-sensei is doing in this condition. Fiore also says that you can cut at the arms of the opponent or at the head of the opponent. And of course, we are also satisfying this condition because Seki-sensei is cutting at the kote of the opponent, which is the arm, of course. Very good, so next action. Now the second condition represented by the crossing at the tip of the sword, the action, the technique which I just mentioned, is thrusting straight at the opponent. Now this is Koteuchi 22 Kaijo, so it is 22 ways of hitting the wrist. But here we have an action which is called ideally thrust at the opponent. It starts from the same conditions, so the two opponents are crossed for a brief amount of time at the tip of the sword. A beat is applied to the tip of the sword, and then an action is landed forward to hit the left wrist of the opponent, but it could easily be, as you can see, a thrust at the opponent. Now the difference is that this action is landed low, so the thrust could be at the belly or chest of the opponent, the lower chest. In Fiore it is landed at the neck, but we are basically very close to the same conditions. It is very similar as an action. Now this third action that we are watching right now is basically the beat from Denti de Zenghia presented by Fiore at the end of the longsword section of his manual. It is an action which may happen by beating aside the opponent medio on medio, or tip on tip, as you can see it right now. The opponent is attacking you in a variety of ways. You beat aside with basically the false edge, which is the back of the katana in this case, the opponent weapon, and you cut on the same line at the opponent arms or at the opponent head if the opponent gets closer. This action fits perfectly that kind of conditions and that kind of action. The fourth action is perfectly represented by the crossing at the middle of the sword, so crossing at the middle of the blade of the opponent, which is another condition shown by Fiore. Fiore says that when you're crossed at the middle of the sword, you can either slide for the opponent's hands or step aside and thrust at the opponent. This condition fits perfectly the slide and strike for the opponent's hands. Actually, in one of the versions of the manual, Fiore says that you have to strike for the left arm, which is precisely what we see here. Here basically we have another version of the beat from Denti de Zenghia. Actually, talking in Fiore terms, this is basically the same condition. I suspect in Asayama Ichiden-ryū is different because it is applied in a different condition. The opponent is doing something else, you're stepping backward and then applying the action. So in Fiore terms, basically the same thing. Here we have an action which fits the romper di punta kind of condition presented by Fiore. It is peculiar, not necessarily in line with our style of fencing because it happens in the bind. It may work, but it is not precisely what you will see applied in our conditions. But it fits the case, even if there's a better representation of it in another technique after this one. And here we have it. Basically this is the breaking the thrust, so the romper di punta, which actually works in the same identical way, at least the way in which it is described. So the opponent is thrusting at you, which seems also to be the case in the Seki-sensei style. The opponent is landing a kind of thrust, especially toward the end of the action. Of course, I suspect that for safety the action happens in a certain way, so with a certain form, to allow it being practiced in a safe way. Here describes more or less the same thing. Also, you have to step aside while landing it. So basically it is perfectly in line with the Fiore style. And of course we have the rompa di punta on the other side, which actually again fits precisely Fiore. We have both the versions of it. Also the way in which the cut is landed, depending from which version it is applied, either on the right side of the opponent blade or on the left, the cut that is landed after it fits the advices of Fiore. So Fiore says that if you are beating the thrust and you are on the right side of the opponent blade, so you jump on your right, let's say, in that condition you want to strike with the false edge. The katana doesn't have the false edge, of course, but here you can see that Seki Sensei applies that kind of turn of the blade which is peculiar of Asayama Ichiden-ryū, which basically functions in such a way that you are almost striking with the mechanics, or basically you're striking with the mechanic of a false edge strike, which makes the strike faster. Instead, on the other version, the one in which Seki Sensei jumps on the left, he is basically attacking the wrist of the opponent with the true edge, so using the normal mechanic of a strike, of a downward strike. So here we have basically a Maki technique which is applied, and then the action ends with a one-handed attack toward the kote of the opponent, which could also be a thrust to the face, actually. Now, the Maki technique is not present in Italian longsword. It is something that it is like peculiar of Japanese styles, at least in my opinion. Then there is a good amount of actions all landed by starting the action with the Maki technique again. As I said, these are not in line with Fiore style, so it is an action that it may work, I don't know, I tried a couple times, but it's not in line with my training, so I'm not good at applying it in sparring. But on average, again, it is not related with the longsword Fiore system of, in general, Italian longsword fencing, at the very least. So this action, which goes to stretto at very close distance, stretto is the close distance actually. In Italian longsword, at that distance you go for stretto actions, so close actions like grabbing, disarming, etc. Or pommel striking, for instance. Of course, I know that in the Asayama Ichiden-ryū style there are these kind of things, but this is like a kote uchi 22 kaiju, so you want to strike the wrist. And in that condition, I would say in Italian longsword you just go in. There is not this kind of thing that you go back at that distance to strike the opponent's wrist, so it is not in line with the Fiore style of fencing. So here we have another application of the crossing at the tip of the blade. Actually, in this case it fits perfectly the case in every single bit of it. So you thrust forward at the opponent feels the thrust coming, goes backward, parries the thrust, and then you do your volte, you rotate the sword, and you cut on the other side at the opponent's wrist or the opponent's arm, which is precisely what Fiore says. It is an action which completely fits the Fiore system of fighting. Actually, probably my favorite one till now, I will say. So here we have another application of the dented Zengyaro bit, which we have seen previously. Now that I am seeing these kind of actions which seem similar to the one that we have already seen, I'm noticing that they seem to be different in terms of initiative. So who is taking the initiative and in which kind of way, and in terms of timing, the timing at which the action is landed, which is very interesting by my perspective. Of course, there may be other differences, like in technical terms, but I am not able to notice them if there are little nuances. But it seems that in timing and the initiative terms, they differ in a relevant way, so that I'm able to see the difference. So this actually reminds me of something which I used to land, and I still land right now, seldomly when it happens. And it is an action which precisely fits what Seki Sensei is doing. So when the weapon of the opponent is low, I tended to land an action which was locking the opponent's arms low. On average it was a thrust, and it was landed when the opponent's weapon wasn't in line, but it fits more or less the case. So again, it was a thrust, not a kote, but you know, We already mentioned this subject. It seems to me that certain actions may be translated easily into thrusts. This one is one of them, but with thrusting I will not land precisely this action, of course, because the weapon of the opponent is in line, so you may be ended up getting stabbed too while stabbing the opponent. In terms of landing a kote cut, so a cut to the wrist, it's fine. These kind of actions instead, in which you basically are landing a downward strike and you just move aside enough so that you don't get hit while hitting the opponent, it is not something that we are used to do. It seems something that it may work if you get precisely the timing of the opponent action, but it is something very hard to land, in my opinion, and it is not something that we find on average described on our manuals. It seems that there was more interest in binding the opponent's sword, parrying, etc., rather than voiding actions, moving to the side. I suspect it may work in the precise terms the action is meant to be landed, but it is very hard by my perspective. And it is something that it is not in our manuals, again, in general. In Fiore Longsword there isn't, for sure. Very good, people. We have analyzed the majority of the Koteuchi 22 Kaiju. As we have seen, there are huge similarities in certain terms between this Kenjutsu style and Fiore Longsword. There are, of course, many differences too, but there are also a lot of similarities. If we want to be nitpicky in terms of every single action, we may analyze footwork, etc., specific attack lines, and so on. Footwork may be different in certain cases, a little bit less or more, depending from the case. The cuts of the katana in many cases are more vertical. There are more diagonal cuts into Fiore Longsword. There are no vertical cuts, basically only vertical. So there are differences anyway in the application of certain actions, but on average there are huge similarities in the patterns of actions which are applied. So very interesting to watch and very interesting to compare. Thanks for watching as always, people. Remember to check my Patreon link in the description if you want to support me and the channel, and as always, see you next time.